My name's Victoria Haskins, and I'm from Newcastle, Moolabimba, which is in New South Wales on Awabakal and Warramai land. And I'm very honoured to be here as a Fellow of the Academy and also a new member of the Council of the Academy. And I hope you're all enjoying the symposium. I want to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin clan as the traditional owners of the land that I'm speaking on and we're meeting here. And also just to echo Malavika's words yesterday about the positive message that came from Tony Garvey's Welcome to Country. As a historian, I think I'm of cross-cultural histories in Australia, I continue to be really impressed by the incredible resilience and generosity of Aboriginal people in this country. And it's also, it's quite pleasing to be presenting in Victoria, which we know was, one of the states that did vote yes, and has also been addressing the Uluru Statement from the Heart and implementing many of those recommendations, and is currently in the process of working through treaties. So, there's good news to keep us going. This morning's session is titled Machine, Memories, Methods and Histories. And the session brings to bear a pronounced historical inflection on the question of the relationship between humans and machines, with our three speakers all being scholars of history and bringing historical insights to bear on this question. Now, I suggested to the panel organisers that if they were to have a chair on historical reflections on machine intelligence, I'd really like to chair it. I don't research in this area myself, but I'm very interested in the intersections between history and artificial intelligence and digital technologies generally. We're really, in history, and I think in humanities generally, but particularly in history, where we are engaging a lot with digital technology. So it's a very interesting question. AI discussions tend to be polarising. It's a high risk or it's a high opportunity. That the fear of being dominated by robots obviously is really a big topic of popular culture at the moment, as Rosalind discussed yesterday. But the use of AI also raises a whole lot of more complex ethical issues, from gender and race bias to questions about teaching, those of us who are in that world, erosion versus enhancement of empathy, and also, how we define what it is to be a human and what it means to think. So 3 papers being presented today engage with the fundamental question of the relationship between human and machine intelligence. Marnie Hughes-Warrington is going to be comparing human and machine historians to ask provocative questions about what is history and what is historical thinking, while Gerard Goggin considers the history of assistive technologies as a way to conceptualise the relationship. And then Richard Yeo looks at some prototype machine intelligence memory aids to ask questions about relationships of control in this human and machine interaction. We're going to run the session in a very traditional format. We've got, I'm giving the speakers between 15 to 20 minutes, followed by 5 minutes question time for each. And it's going to be a bit tricky for me to get onto Slido, so probably prefer just questions in the room if that's possible. But Shane, I don't know if you can see Slido. Yeah, so if there's something you can let me know, but we'll have 5 minutes each. We should then finish up with an extra 5 minutes at the end if there's any further questions. And I'll introduce each speaker as they present. So I'm introducing Marnie, who we can now see you, Marnie. Marnie Hughes-Warrington, AO, is Standing Acting Vice-Chancellor and Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Research and Enterprise at the University of South Australia. She's Professor of History Theory at the University of South Australia and Adjunct Professor of History at ANU. Her work across philosophy and history has advanced the recognition of history making across the globe, including global recognition of Australian Aboriginal historiographies. In amongst her obviously important senior leadership work, she's also authored or edited 10 books. The latest is History from Loss in 2023, edited with Daniel Wolfe, and also in 2023, the Rutledge Companion to History in the Moving Image, edited with Kim Nelson and Mia Tracy. Her current book project, which she will be speaking from today, is Machine Historians, which explores the logic that shapes how humans and artificial agents make history and reframes artificial intelligence as a historical discipline. So I'll hand over to you, Marnie.
Good morning, and thank you very much, Victoria, and I really want to thank the Academy for putting this event together. And hello from Singapore, and I also wish to acknowledge the Wiradjuri people and the generosity of their welcome to the beautiful country there. So I'm really interested in this question of what a machine historian is versus a human historian, and whether that question actually begins to matter as we go forward in time. I'm going to ask the Academy to proceed with the slides, if you don't mind, moving forward to the next slide. Okay, thank you. All right, so my point of departure here for this talk is for really us to think about, when did we come to ask, do you mean a human historian? Has that time already passed, or is it still coming? And the context for asking this question are pretty broad. It can include, for instance, thinking about codes of ethics, like the Australian Historical Association's Code of Ethics, whether we actually do need to ask the question, is it a machine that we're talking about when we talk about histories that are made without exaggeration or unwarranted claims? But also, if we could get you to prompt forward, please. All kinds of contexts like this one. So 2016, and if I can ask you to prompt again forward. 2016, and the AHA knows about this example. 2016, a robot called Todo Robot, which successfully passed the history entrance exam for the University of Tokyo. That's not just a multiple choice test that the robot passed, but actually it was a short essay of 600 words on maritime trade in East and Southeast Asia. So I'm very, very interested in the question, are you a human historian, becoming a question for us, and a question, for instance, in university admissions, in the assessment of work, through to codes of ethics, and even, for instance, the judgment of prizes, and perhaps even in future consideration of membership at the Academy, if I could be so radical and so bold. Let's go forward a slide. Okay, so the reason I'm interested in this question, I think it's possible, is something that Lee, this year, he argued that the discipline of history is a really interesting one because it shifted from being what he called a walking discipline to a sitting discipline at some point. And what he means by that is we go from history being a performative, alive subject where people actually present their histories, both as eyewitnesses or people that are recounting the experiences of others live to others and personalising those stories in particular ways, through to history being a discipline that presents its work, for instance, through written form. And here we have an example of Herodotus's text. Now, what is interesting for me in this situation is when you make this transposition, perhaps as Lee claims, we may open ourselves up a very long time ago to the idea of even weak artificial intelligence. So we go from me presenting a history live to you and you seeing me and asking me questions, to me presenting you a text. And a question that I'd pose to all of you and for me to think through in future is really, is this the equivalent of passing a slip of paper under a door in the manner of a Turing test, or as you and I are more familiar, completing one of those little capture tests every single time? So every time a history text is something that we pick up, we engage with, are we asking the question, is this a history? And are we asking ourselves the question, is this a history by a human? And so this long history of presenting texts in this way is an opportunity for us to think through that deep history and to think about opportunities to identify the conditions under which machine historians might make histories, if they can, and if they can, the conditions under which they may produce histories that are either good to our view or histories that we view to be deeply problematic or even in the extreme, hate histories. Now, in presenting it this way, I'm not meaning to suggest that there's a kind of distanced relationship between the history maker and the person who's receiving the history or the audience. Arguably, when people start writing histories or making books, they shift the relationship away from live performance with you and I together to actually me being able to take that book eventually in this century and last century into our homes. So not actually a distant relationship, but actually a relatively close relationship. Can I ask you to proceed to the next slide, please? So if we take this kind of view that every history is an opportunity to think about what a history is, and every history is an opportunity to think about what an historian is, I'm interested particularly in the current book project I have called Machine Historians, in thinking about the logical conditions that help to make that possible. And in that case, and I'm not going to discriminate these two really cleanly or tightly, but there's two kinds of what we call ontologies, as computer scientists would call it. As a metaphysician, I'm less sure that this is actually the right word, but it's a pretty good one. So there's two ontologies that we can think about when we think about this passing of text backward and forward, and the idea that we might need to ask the question, is this historian actually human? So firstly, there's a big ontology, the kind of bigger conditions or the ground rules for which it's possible for a machine historian to flourish. And there's a few that I've kind of proposed for the book and that I'm working through. And I'm very happy to take feedback and questions on these ones because I'm intrigued to get people's feedback. There's a few. So for instance, we have dependency in some cases like Japan on a small number of historians or history texts. The reason why Todai Robot was able to pass the history exam is because there's a very small number of state mandated history texts. That's not difficult for a robot probably to master in due course. But in other contexts, we may have a small number of historians or history texts because a school or a university might not be able to afford, students might not be able to afford those texts, or because we actually have online platforms that promote particular kinds of histories and not others. So we may find ourselves overly dependent on a small number of histories, not by a matter of choice, but because books are banned, because books are mandated, or because people can't afford them, or because platforms promote them. So we have a dependency in that case. We may also have an issue where those small texts are part of a much bigger system, or what I'd call a very wide surface area, where lots of people are making histories. So you and I can all go and actually make a history and upload it to the web. We can kind of make all kinds of claims, doesn't mean that they're good, but we can actually upload them to the web. And the ways in which we tell histories might be highly distributed throughout the globe. And they can also be misaligned to the kinds of history making the professional historians make. They can be misaligned through medium. So for instance, professional historians may continue to prefer to write histories, whereas we know that historical films are the most common way in which people actually come to histories. So there's a little bit of a misalignment between the ways in which the profession sees history and the way in which people are distributing histories or they're coming to histories. And so there we got a high dependency and a highly distributed system. We also might not have approaches to computer science that allow for some of the fuzziness of historical writing or history making. And one of the best examples I can think of is what we call intention. So the idea that in blunt form, one single piece of evidence can be interpreted in multiple different ways by multiple historians in really, really fruitful ways. But when you come to program a computer, even with things like fuzzy logic, it's very, very difficult to account for that because fuzzy logic may wish to present that piece of evidence according to a kind of linear scale of probability or acceptability. And the ways in which historians work is often not linear and doesn't reflect evenly distributed kind of distributions or notions of probability. So we may have approaches to logic that don't fit particularly well, historians. And then we have finally, as I said before, this notion of, ethics as actually being around humans. And that way of thinking may lead people to kind of miss the opportunity to have a discussion on responsibility and accountability, but also a focus on personhood might not be helpful if we're really talking about a system of weak AI or these texts that we are receiving and passing backwards and forwards. the person that there might not be a person actually producing the text. So us thinking about personhood might not help us to figure out what to do with a bot that's actually producing hate histories that's fueling violence in particular contexts. So this is a really interesting situation, and it reminds me of cybersecurity in a way. We might have dependency on a small number of people that are technically experts who can train us to think about how to engage with the online world in a really, really good way. A very broad surface area of that online world, forms of logic that, you know, might not help us to navigate that space, and codes of ethics that might not be actually up to date or helping us to think through these issues. So there's a bigger picture opportunity to think here. And then there's a smaller ontology, which are the kinds of rules or the approaches to making history. And so in my project, I've been interested to look at both the contexts that would allow machine historians to flourish and even hate historians to flourish, but also the kind of small rules that would make a really good history. So what makes a good history, and how could we judge that actually one is worth accepting as fair or good, or one that's worth paying attention to? So, you know, for instance, Todai Robot, when it was programmed to pass the exam in Tokyo, it was instructed that histories are written in chronological order and that histories move from proximate to distant geography. Now, of course, if you're a historiographer and you look closely at histories, that's not how they work, but it was good enough for the robot to pass. And if it's good enough for a robot to pass, we find ourselves in the realm of asking the question about whether it's good enough for students to pass an exam as well. So it's not just about producing great histories or really amazing histories. We really are needing to ask ourselves, how do we produce just adequate histories in that case? If you could prompt the slide forward for me, please. So in the book, I've been looking at the different fingerprints of historians, and the way in which I've been approaching this, and you know, lots of feedback on the methodology would be very, very welcome. So I've been looking at prize-winning histories, some of which are academy-based prizes, and some of which are much more general prizes, to think about the kinds of ways in which historians approach the production of texts. The limitation of my methodology is that, of course, I am working through English language texts, but also I am working through written texts, although towards the end of the book, I will be looking at historical films, because I think that's a really fruitful space to think about visual logic in the production of histories. So I'm going to give you just one example today. I set myself a little exam in the writing of the book and prompting to ask myself whether I could actually pick the winner of the Wolfson History Prize. This is a British History Prize. It's open to British citizens, so therefore I'm not eligible. And at the moment, a machine's not eligible to enter because it couldn't be deemed to be a British citizen. The criteria for the Wolfson Prize are pretty general. It's just got to be a well-researched history, but very, very accessible. I've also looked at the performance of ChatGPT, or the GPT series, to see whether it could actually write a Wolfson Prize winning history. If we could prompt forward. And I'm interested in this particular case, in how prize-winning historians actually ask questions, because Sarah Mazza has put forward the idea that actually historians begin with questions, although interestingly in the quote that I've just given you, she said that social scientists tend to answer their questions, whereas historians ask questions, then they go through their work and then they don't answer them, which is a really, really interesting methodological fingerprint for historians, which is, you know, ask yourself a question, don't answer it. So I've started with the 2020 shortlist of Wolfson History Prizes. And what I've looked in this case is to try and figure out what kinds of questions they ask, and also how they deal with those questions and whether they answer them. And at the same time, I've compared the performance of the GPT series, and thanks to the work of Yuqin Zhang, we can see, for instance, that when you give GPT questions for which it doesn't have answers in its corpus, because it's pretty much a fixed corpus large language model, it can only answer 5 out of every 100 questions easily, and it can only answer 2 out of every hard questions correctly. And a hard question in this case is a really interesting one for historians. A hard question is one where there's more than one potential answer. So that idea of historical intention I was talking about before, GPT actually at the moment struggles to deal with things like that. But I'd have to also say too, if we were really honest about it, probably history students would struggle with intention as well. So knowing that GPT doesn't do well with this case, I wanted to see whether historians answered their own questions and whether they actually posed novel questions in their works, and whether they, like Mazza argued, opened with particular questions and ended with others. So let's go forward into the next slide, and you can see the text, everything from a history of Ravenna right through to really amazing work by Rebecca Clifford on child survivors of the Holocaust, and whether they actually can be counted as survivors even if they're too young to remember what happened. So I just literally, like every student or every machine, went through those texts and actually looked at literally how many questions they were asking. And you can see from this first block here that there is a wide range of responses to this. So for instance, Rebecca Clifford's work on child survivors of the Holocaust has 185 questions in it. And I've used direct questions, and that's obviously a methodological limitation, but I'll come to that in just a moment. And that's partly because it's an oral history text, and she's included the questions that were asked of the survivors, right through to the low point of Black Spartacus, where, you know, this wonderful book on Toussaint Louverture has got very, very few direct questions in it. So here's an interesting thing already. If you're a student of history or wanting to train a machine historian, there's a wide range, even just in this small language model, between those who are asking questions and those who are not asking questions. So then I began to break it down. If I could ask you to proceed again with the slide, click again. Where are those questions? Is it the case, like Sarah Mazza, that they actually open with questions, that they then don't answer those questions or proceed to others? And this is where it gets really interesting. We find, for instance, that nobody shortlisted for the Wolfson Prize in that year had a question mark in the title of their book, that there are very few questions up in the front end of books. But where you do find questions throughout these books is towards the end. That as you read on, the frequency of the questions increases throughout the text. And interestingly enough, these tend to be rhetorical questions to the reader, and they're unanswered questions. And this is actually really, really interesting for me as a historiographer, because when I compare it to journal papers, and you'll see that in this chart here, that the number of questions in the notes and bibliographies is pretty high, the number of journal papers with question marks is actually quite high. And that's a really interesting observation for us, which is that in a journal paper, people might have a singular question that they're trying to respond to, whereas in a longer exegesis or book, they may actually just have a more open topic with multiple questions, or like Sarah Mazza, they might start with a question and actually end up with other questions throughout the length of the text. Either way, it's a really interesting thing for students to come to this point and say actually that, you know, unlike an essay, the writer of a history book is not literally starting with a question most of the time. It may be buried in their text. It may be an indirect question. But if I'm a learner of history or if I'm a machine, I might not see that. And I might actually see that the best way of producing a history that's going to win me a prize is to not ask questions up the front, but to ask questions up the back and to make them rhetorical. So unlike ChatGPT, I'm not going to start by responding to a question. I'm actually going to start by making statements, and I'll move on to questions. So on the basis of this, I created a little rough ontology, if I could ask you to click. And I said, you know, set myself the task of, could I actually create an ontology to predict, or could I actually make a Wolfson winner? So I went through and said, yes, okay, I'm more likely to win if I don't have a question mark in the title of my book. I could include question marks in quotes from others. I could include question marks if I've got oral histories, but generally not others. That I should increase the frequency of my questions throughout my text and move towards rhetorical questions. And again, I should cite journal articles probably with question marks. You're probably horrified partly by what I'm doing here, but what I'm really trying to do is to kind of boil down and say, could we think about the ways in which historians you know, go about the writing of history? Is it possible to fingerprint that? And if it is, could we use that to identify malicious or hate histories? Now, you'll actually be delighted to know that what I did was I took this little ontology and then I tested it against the winner of the Wolfson Prize in that year, which was Black Spartacus, and found that my model was actually pretty hopeless because Black Spartacus was not asking very many questions. But I did get right the point that there actually tends not to be a question in the title of the book. And in fact, if you go and check all of the shortlists and the winners of the Wolfson History Prize, to my knowledge, there is not a single one that actually has a question mark in the title, which is actually really, really interesting. So in training my machine historian, I've actually come to the point where I've got one rule that's probably right. The other rules are actually pretty bodgy. Now, the point of doing this exercise, again, is actually really to begin to highlight for us that actually producing a history is not a simple thing. Now, I don't need to tell most of you that, but if you're a student of history, it's actually pretty mystifying how to do this really, really well. You can read technical manuals about how to produce a history, but the variations in the way in which historians write could actually provide really fertile ground for us to think about rich logics for history, multiple logics. But if you're a student of history, that's a really, really challenging place to be. And if you're the producer of a machine historian, a more challenging place to be. When I've looked at questions, I found that picture, but in the rest of my book, for instance, I've looked at chronologies and found, for instance, that machine historians tend to write in strict chronological order, whereas human historians don't. And if we look at things like that, or the use of conditionals such as if, historians use the word if a lot, and possible and probable, whereas machines don't, we may actually find ourselves, even with my very poor ontology here, not very accurate one, building up a bit of a profile that allows us to ask the question, is this a human historian? And if it isn't, is it one that's actually engaged in works or engaged in the production of texts that are malicious? Now, that's a bit of a gallop through my work, but I know we've got tight time, so I'm going to stop there. And I know, Vicky, you're probably going to take questions at the end, so I'll come off slides at this point.
We are fairly tight for question time. I'm sure there are questions in the room. I might just take one question quickly if we have a question in the room. No one's jumping up, but I'm sure I have questions, and I can come back to those at the end of the session. If you can hang on, I know you're in Singapore, so.
I am in Singapore. It's a beautiful morning, and it's a bit full on, so I'll give people a bit of a chance to think about what they've just had very quickly.
Yeah. Okay, we'll come back to you, Marnie. Thank you very much. Now, if we can put Marnie on a small screen so she doesn't have to be big brothering us, that would be great. I'm now going to introduce Gerard Goggin, who is, I would call, a historian, even though technically he's a professor of media and communications at the University of Sydney. He's the founding editor of the journal Internet Histories and co-editor of Routledge Companion to Global Internet Histories and Oral Histories of the Internet and the World. So, include digital disability and Routledge Companion to Disability and Media. With Kansong Victor Zhang, he is working on a book project on disability, socio-technical imaginaries and politics. So I hand over to you, Gerard.
Thanks very much, Victoria, and good morning, everyone. So I just wanted to also acknowledge the traditional owners, the Wiradjuri people of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And given, I think, the topic of my paper as well, I just wanted to acknowledge the work in Indigenous disability research that's really starting to flourish at the moment. And my colleague from Sydney Uni, John Gilroy, is holding, I think, one of the first Indigenous disability research symposiums next week, which is incredibly exciting. So today, what I aim to do in this panel is to combine, I suppose, an interest in media histories and digital histories with disability, and to bring that, I hope, to speak to the machine-human question as well. So, just to start, I suppose, I wanted to just position disability as a kind of really important emerging intersectional area of cultural, social and political life as we know. In universities, disability studies has really grown into an interdisciplinary field, and really with a shift to seeing disability as a kind of generative form of knowledge and embodiment, and offering ways of critiquing societal norms and structures. And we see, particularly at the heart of this, we see moves to build a technologically enabled society where disabled people are embraced in the fabric of life, as set out in the 2009 UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability. It's a treaty that actually underpins the rights of media, information and technology for all of us, in fact. It's one of the first treaties in a way that does that. And alongside this, we're faced with the kind of new kinds of digital inequalities and the shaping of digital and social inclusion and exclusion faced by people with disabilities, represented in the kind of emerging social and technological spaces, especially with emerging technologies. But how societies imagine, enact and make technology and the complex histories and imaginaries behind this is not well understood. And this really is a major missed opportunity, and particularly given that there's a recurring trope in this, that disability innovation has been at the heart of how technology has emerged and is emerging. So colleagues Mara Mills, who's a historian of technology at NYU, and Jonathan Stern, famous for his book on the MP3 format, they observe in a collection on media and disability, quote, that histories of closed captioning, audio description and subtitling demonstrate that users with disability are often at the forefront of innovation of media systems that make them useful for everyone, end quote. Now we've got an example of this at hand, although we can't see it here, but the captioning is turned on in Zoom, I think. In PowerPoint there's captioning, but that's too hard to run today. And I suppose during the pandemic, we did have another live experiment, we just heard from our colleague earlier, where things that people with disabilities had struggled with, like being able to, participate fully, say on a part-time basis in the workforce, now proved possible for everyone because of the adoption of Zoom, and things like captioning and other things started to become, more universal, as it were, but created new kinds of exclusion as well. So I think these histories are really important to consider at a time when technology is front and centre in these disability and societal transformations, especially in the area of automation. So I've got some examples here in terms of, the long use now, or the longish, I suppose, in a historical sense a bit short, but the last 2 decades, automated tools have been used to check web accessibility, for instance. Web accessibility, really well-known area of accessibility, and automated tools have been used in that as well. We see the rise of apps and the smartphone being a technology that we all particularly started to rely on, or it was compulsory to rely on in the pandemic. And we see a range of apps. I have here the Microsoft Sing AI app that, quote, narrates the world around us. So there's a blind person holding a smartphone, looking out at sort of his environment, and that can be used, that app, to focus on objects, to focus on bits of text, and it will read it out to you. There is also a competitor to that in Google's Lookout app, and I've got a screenshot of that from another blind person holding up their mobile phone to read a business card as well. Now there's a range of other kind of experiments and technologies underway. I've just got one of these here, Project Sidewalk, which is an initiative to develop at scale accessibility information and collect it in people's environment. Part, I suppose, of the personalisation too of technologies that's really been data-driven and in this area. So there's many other examples as well. So we see this sort of potential here of AI and machine learning to advance the cause of accessibility and digital inclusion. But there's something else, I think, that's really unfolding and highlighted. It's an incredible resource for us. And that's in this kind of advent of a new phase of human-machine relations augured by automation and AI. Disability has a lot to add in deepening our understanding. We saw that yesterday with Jill Bennett's great project, I think, around dementia and the co-design of that to really show the possibilities and also the approaches and the kind of ideas that come to stake and how they play out. But I suppose along the promising kind of developments as well, we've got a range of other things. I've got here the generative AI case with the colleagues who do research on communication disability, Bronwyn Helmsley and others making the point about future AI being accessible and inclusive. But there are various other concerns that people are bringing to bear. Employment and work platforms, where people with disabilities are underrepresented in workplaces. So in robo-hiring platforms in a range of other contexts, there's going to be issues about representation. In gig economy platforms, you've got new forms of debility and disability coming up with algorithmic kind of applications and the algorithmic logics of those. You have injustices, clear injustices. Robo-debt in the Australian context is one of these that we've just had unfold, in which disability and people with disabilities were really at the heart of what went on with those applications there, and we're still trying to understand that. And the kind of governmentality of people's lives, but particularly people with disability, engaged in that. And we've got a number of cases where I suppose one of the overarching things where AI and emerging technologies are clearly modelled on people's bodies and particular bodies and particular kind of conceptions of people. And we heard more from Talfan's fantastic lecture yesterday about that. But we think, for instance, of driverless cars and automated mobilities, for instance, as one of these where the kinds of mobilities of people with disabilities and their histories are not well understood. And we have a range of other areas. I'll just mention one. There's a leading researcher, Cynthia Bennett, who's just gone to Google as a chief engineer. And with her colleagues, she's done some work on the use of machine learning for generating descriptions of images of people. And they sort of note that, while these are intended to make the photos accessible to blind people, for instance, who can't see them, machine-generated image descriptions may also perpetuate documented gender, race and disability based bias, underscoring the need for those descriptions to be written with care. So one of the key issues in this, before I go more explicitly to look at some of the history of assistive and disability technology, is that we have a long way to go in the contemporary world before we register some of these. I'm just going to check. I've got some examples in the screenshots of some of the examples I've just given. And I'll go on to this shortly. So in Australia, for instance, we had a pioneering human rights report in 2021 on technology and human rights. It had disability, a whole suite of kind of recommendations that haven't been acted on. We have an exciting initiative around disability data asset that the government's talked about that's playing out as well. So there's a lot in play. But I think the two kind of big issues that I think many of us working in the area feel need to be addressed are really that disability is the first one. Disability is still at the margins of the conversations, starting to creep in a bit, and the conversations and the forces and structures that are shaping technology. And the second is that the relations between disability and technology are not well understood. So the kind of machinery questions that disability sparks offer a lost opportunity. And so I want now to just draw in on work with a book that I'm writing with Victor Kwansong Shuang, who's a leading Singaporean disability scholar, on disability and emerging technology. I want to explore that a little bit. And I just also wanted to acknowledge some other collaborations that I'm engaged on with a group of disability researchers around Australia to do a benchmark project about disability and digital inequalities, and a collaboration with consumer and disability groups through the Australian Communications Consumer Action Network as well. So to move then to talk more explicitly about histories. So there's a large largely unacknowledged history of human-machine encounters and imaginaries in disability communities that are really in a way cordoned off from mainstream areas of technology and innovation. Now we can see this particularly in communication, which is a really important contemporary area that cuts across many areas now. And we think one of the issues there is that people with disabilities' kind of expansive use of technology is often not fitted the dominant model. Now, one of the positives is that the ways in which scholarship and research, theory and in design as well is starting to embrace the kind of area can see, for instance, in the area of human-machine communication, there's an emphasis now about looking at machine subjects with which people make meaning. And so it's in this context that I've been thinking about this idea that human-machine communication should always involve thinking about disability. It's in quotes. And that's an idea from Dan Goodley and Catherine Runswick-Cole, who pick up the idea of the dishuman. And dishuman they borrow from the disability and literary scholar Leonard Davis's idea of dismodernity. The idea that disability can become a new prism through which we think about our contemporary modernity, but also through technology as well. So I think one of the things I'm interested here is the recasting of our ideas of human communication, about the relationships of machines and humans via ideas of disability. And I think what we see is that across a range of research in this area, we're grappling with the culturally dominant idea that machines are often regarded as non-human, paradoxically perhaps superhuman, or we've heard in various ways, are ontologically different to human. And so speaking of disability and human-machine communication is, I think, really interesting and challenging in that area, because disability has also posed questions for what's considered human. That disability and people with disabilities are often been regarded as not human or subhuman or treated in very inhumane ways. And people have been thinking about, engaged in rethinking the human via disability. And I think this project has real implications for how we understand communication. So if we're going to, for instance, take communication seriously in a broader way and take seriously the communication modes, styles and requirements of everyone, then really we need to think about the way that communication transpires in a range of different sensory modes, in touch communication, different kinds of voice and audio, and visual communication formats and so on. Now, digital communications offered a lot of affordances and possibilities of this. We think of the smartphone and the use of haptics and touch technology in this, for instance. But there's also major issues in terms of, for instance, recorded voice communication. So if we look, for instance, at the ways that digital recorded voice communication is embedded in mobile voice assistants, embedded in things like smart home technologies and so on, we have some really interesting and challenging things to think about. So here I just wanted to briefly bring up the kind of example that the antecedents of these technologies that we're using now have their place in the development of speech software and machines, particularly Ray Kurzweil's and others' work on optical character recognition and early handheld devices. Really interesting kind of work, and it's been acclaimed in many ways. Involved collaborations with disability groups, but also in specific ways in which, if you go back to the history and start unpacking this, there's also some, I think, problems in this as well. And I've got a screenshot here of the original kind of device that was put together, that Kurzweil put together here, and his account of that saying, the end of 1975, we put together 3 new technologies we'd invented: Omni Font OCR, CCD, flatbed scanners, and text-to-speech. And so we've got a picture here of a woman who's kind of, putting those devices together and working with those. Now, a major issue in these innovations is the framing of disability in this. Often, and this is a kind of cross-cutting thing, the framing of disability as a kind of deficit or in need of a cure. And I'm looking here, thank you very much, Victoria, for the time reminder. And a historian, Sarah Bell, who's done a revisionist account of the Kurzweil reading machine. And I think this is a bit of an exemplary piece of work that's going on at the moment with historians working across history of design, history of assistive technology and disability. And she points out that, in fact, Kurzweil and this, we said the early prototype of this, but the later versions of this, were used as symbols of what she calls technological solutionism. And she notes, the spectacle of a talking machine, named after its genius young inventor, captured the attention of lawmakers and the public with its charisma, hiding the funded research that made the machine possible, the needs of blind persons for infrastructural and systemic social changes, and the realities of use and maintenance on which the machine's return on investment would actually eventually fail. There's a more complicated story here too, in reflecting on that sort of passage about the successes of technology and the failures of them and how that complicated sort of recursive curve works. So I think these kind of histories are incredibly important to think through and to look at some of the details of when we're looking at the contemporary time and projects, for instance, like Google's Project Euphonia, which is a platform to address the fact that the voice recognition technologies are only dealing with a range of the possible voices. And Project Euphonia offers a platform by which people with a range of different voices can have their phrases recorded, and for that to be part of the training set for these technologies. And I think one of the kind of complexities of this goes to how we see assistive technology. And that what we often find is in the early stages of technology that there's a kind of gesturing towards or engagement with the people with disability and disability communities that then gets passed over later on. And Mara Mills in her work calls this the assistive pretext. And the assistive pretext being a kind of moment where you see people with disabilities' needs and requirements being imagined, not necessarily in collaboration with them, and then passed over for a later form of development as well. So we can see this also in the area of driverless cars, that in Google in 2011, it launched its driverless car initiative featuring a blind Californian man piloting the vehicle. And there's a long history to that, but one of the things that we've seen with driverless cars since is that disability and the possibilities of transportation for that has fallen out of the picture. So I've gone over the time as probably now, but I just wanted to, I suppose, point to that what we can do and need to do, I think, with these histories is provide the opportunity to open up alternative visions and alternative imaginaries around this. And I think that part of what we can appreciate from these histories are things like the critiques of normalcy and the kind of shaping of normalcy and norms in technology, concepts such as interdependence, which come out of disability scholarship and other kinds of scholarship as well, the dynamics and specificities of data when it comes to people with disabilities, the kind of foundational and radical work that's needed in design. And I think the call that's been made by a range of people about reframing AI in terms of the conversations we're having here, accounts of power, justice, human rights and democracy. And I think disability is not well understood in that, and that's where we have a real opportunity through the histories particularly to enrich the conversation and reframe it. Thank you very much.
So don't go away, okay. Because we do have 5 minutes for questions for Gerard. Certainly, from my perspective, I'm really interested in care labour and the history of care labour, so the use of AI in care labour I find really interesting, but I won't take up the oxygen here. Question, yeah, Ingrid.
Thank you. Ingrid Pillow from Macquarie University. So thanks a lot, Gerard. That was super interesting. My perspective comes from research with people in Australia who have low or limited proficiency in English, and I think they face some of the similar barriers that people with a disability face. And I guess my question relates to maybe looking away from the technologies, and I've got two questions specifically there. One is that it seems to me that some assistive technologies, as they're being rolled out en masse, are actually creating new forms of disability, if you will, or new barriers to access for people with low literacy, for instance, or low digital literacy. That's one question. And the other question I have, looking away from the technologies, is that I really see a huge danger in suggesting that the technologies will now remove all those barriers, and we do no longer need human mediators. That's specifically a concern I have around the way we are currently talking about interpreters no longer being necessary, right. Or we no longer need languages teaching in Australia, because very soon languages knowledge will be displaced by technologies, and the technology really is not there yet. So you've mentioned languages actually, but into the foreseeable future, we are not going to have machine translation that will actually be able to even operate in an error-free manner, let alone actually negotiate interactions.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you very much. I mean, I very much agree with both of those. So, I mean, I wrote with Christopher Newell a book about 20 years ago called Digital Disability, where we tried to make exactly that point, that, you know, there are new exclusions at play, right? And I think we see this also with the use of technology in the pandemic, for the research, for instance, and the experiences of people with intellectual disabilities, where that loss of face-to-face contact was a real kind of problem. And more generally, the digital by default is a real issue. But I think what you say in terms of literacy is really critical. And we have a range of colleagues, Karen Soldatic being perhaps the leading one in the Australian context, working particularly with multicultural communities in Western Sydney and elsewhere around that intersection. And she has a project recently, she picks up the care issue on sensors and care as well. So I think that's really important. On the second one, that is also really important. So in this, what's going on live, the automation of captioning, I was engaged in a conversation with a scholarly association I sit on the international board of about our conferences, saying, and we're try and be multilingual as well, saying, do we need live captioning, you know, by professional captioners who would then caption? And there's a view, no, we can automate it. And it's not the case, it's different. And when you look at how live captioning happens, it happens with the interaction. They actually rely on automated captioning, and they've had phases where they would like live caption events. They used to sit in the audience, but what they would do is actually put them on a feed to their workplace, and they would revoice using voice recognition to caption. So I think there's that complexity to it. We're clearly, I think, those questions of language are really critical, and there's that real kind of interface between the languages and the accessibility that plays out in different ways.
We can take one more quick question. Oh, yeah, okay. Gerard, what role do you think law and regulation plays in undermining the assistive capabilities of technology?
That's a really good question, actually. Look, I certainly think it can. I think there's scholarship on this. Americans have led the way in some of the law and regulation, and there's a sort of actual study that shows that in some ways what was assumed to be the sort of idea, and I would subscribe to it probably, you know, that you need strong laws and policy, because of the narrow concepts of disability and accessibility and some extent technology dynamism that underlies some of those earlier famous laws in the US, that actually there was a kind of not a great outcome of that. So I think that can play out in that question's a really good one, but it plays out in different ways, and part of them might be the interaction between laws on accessibility and other laws. So if you're thinking about digital by default, and I think it's a paradox in the problematic term digital inclusion, you know, in trying to include people digitally and address digital inequalities, it's a big aim of the ADMS that's really important. On the other hand, if you have laws that might be in social security system or other laws that are interacting with those, so the interaction of that can be, I think, one of the biggest undermining problems.
Thanks very much, Gerard. Another round of applause and then, well, thank you. So I'll now introduce our third speaker for the session, Richard Yeo, who I'm sure many of you know. Richard is a historian of science and a fellow of the Academy of Humanities. He's Emeritus Professor at Griffith University, Brisbane. Richard's written on European and especially British intellectual history and the history of science between 1600 to 1900. His books include Defining Science, William Whewell, not sure if I pronounced that right, Natural Knowledge and Public Debate in Early Victorian Britain, Encyclopedic Visions, Scientific Dictionaries and Enlightenment Culture, and notebooks English Virtuosi and Early Modern Science. And he recently co-edited an article on Towards the History of the Questionnaire, a special issue of Intellectual History Review. So I'll hand over to you now. Thanks, Richard.
Okay. Well, first of all, a thanks to Julian and Jean for convening all this, and to Victoria. Sorry, that's right. Yeah, I just pushed it away. And to Victoria for convening and arranging this panel. Here we see on Time magazine, April 1944, the American electrical engineer Vannevar Bush as Man of the Year, an award they started in 1927. He was professor at MIT and currently director of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, and as such he supervised the Manhattan Project, initiated in August 1942, that produced the bombs dropped on Japan on the 6th and 9th of August 1945. He advised both President Roosevelt and Truman, and he appeared in a few scenes of the recent film Oppenheimer, centred on the physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer. In the midst of all this trial and tribulation of bombs and war, he, in July 1945, wrote an article in the Atlantic Monthly called As We May Think, in a section called A Scientist Looks at Tomorrow. There he sketched a device never built that relied on microfilm and photoelectric cells to store and retrieve the documents. This memex, as he called it, offers a window, I think, onto the history of the relations between humans and machines, our title, about 40 years before the first personal computers and 50 years before the World Wide Web. So it comes at a time when automation is commonplace since the Industrial Revolution and before, all kinds of mechanical machines. But Bush and others were posing the question, how far can that go into intellectual tasks? Time magazine again, at least some of its editors, on the 20th anniversary of the memex in 1966 or thereabout, said, "We think of you as the man who envisioned information technology." Quite a big claim. So what did Bush say to deserve this assessment, and was it warranted? In his own words, to quote, "A memex is a device in which an individual stores all his books, records, communications, and which is mechanised so that it may be consulted with exceeding speed and flexibility. It is an enlarged, intimate supplement to his memory." He saw the storage capacity as huge. If the user inserted 5,000 pages of material a day, it'd take 100 years to fill the thing. Now, seeking a wider readership than the Atlantic Monthly, he got the article published in Life magazine, and it's only then that he provides illustrations. He seems to have produced this idea with no blueprint or draft whatsoever, which is odd for an engineer. So the first time you see anything, it's here, done by the graphic artist of Life magazine. So I'll just show these slides. That's the memex. It's a desk with a whole set of microfilm reels inside it and machinery, including the photoelectric cell, which I won't go into here. There are screens where you can write notes, and you can get two screens up together, and code them in such a way that they will be tied together and retrieved together on demand. There are two screens because he mentions someone working on the Crusades and the weapons of both sides of the Crusades. These are terribly inaccurate, but that's what came up. The idea is that you could join those two. They come from different sources, could be an encyclopedia or another document. You can join them and the microfilm, the two will come up together. He didn't only talk about memex. In fact, the first three quarters of the article are about other kinds of devices, such as this notion of a head-worn camera on a research scientist who can just click and capture exactly what he saw at the moment. I should say, just on the run, but I can't go into it, that that idea of linking the documents, of course, foreshadows hypertext. At least Ted Nelson, the person who coined the word hypertext in 1965, credited Bush with that connection. Now, in some ways, memex could be seen to belong to the history of ideas about fingertip access to and control of books and information. So here we have 1588 designed by the Italian engineer Agostino Romelli of a book wheel. Ideal, he said, for those suffering from gout who can't get around their library very well, la gotta in Italian. Thus, this was a physical aid, but I want to point out, and this is the one we showed on our website, that it had the potential to act as a mental one by allowing easier comparison of the various books. We know about chain books in medieval libraries. Here we have the possibility of a reader chained to a book wheel, reading incessantly the same books, kind of nightmare. That's my nightmare, not Romelli's. Now, the resemblance of the memex to a Bush wheel is, of course, limited because Bush wanted books on microfilm and to be able to interact them in new ways, as I just showed. But the allure of compression promised by microfilm was infectious in the 1930s. H.G. Wells believed that this miniaturization provided the exciting opportunity of storing all knowledge, allowing universal access, and constituting, to quote, an efficient index to all human knowledge, ideas and achievements, a complete planetary memory or world brain. Anyone who's used microfilms, you've got to be a certain age like me, in the 1970s and 80s will laugh at this prospect because microfilm, fluttering reels, and there's microfiche cards that slid like jelly on the glass plate. But anyway, Bush and others, everyone, including Bush, and companies and the Navy in particular, had already microfilm documents. Now, the name of the machine, memex, needs a bit of explanation. Bush said it needs a name, and here's one. But he didn't just stumble on this. It's possibly either this kind of thing, a contraction of memory extender, extending memory, or memory index, because the memory is indexed, as I showed, by these connections that he makes. Now, and both of these match two of his main preoccupations. The problem of how memory, individual memory, can handle exponential growth of knowledge, and secondly, the problem of finding that knowledge once it's there somewhere. How do you get it out of a library or whatever? Now, Bush was completely right about exponential growth of knowledge, but it wasn't a new perception. The concern with what they call the multitude of books was evident in early modern Europe. In 1680, Wilhelm Gottfried Leibniz, German philosopher and mathematician, but who was also a librarian, complained about what he said, quote, the horrible mass of books which keeps on growing so that eventually the disorder will become nearly insurmountable. But whereas Leibniz then tried making various catalogues of libraries to address this, Bush ridiculed library catalogues and subject indexes and put forward this notion. And he also inflated this idea of the individual facing the whole world of knowledge with no assistance except for a memex. The second of Bush's claims, the most dramatic one, is that these trails of associated items mirrored the brain's memory and thinking processes. To quote, the human mind operates by association, with one item in its grasp, it snaps instantly to the next, and that is suggested by the association of thoughts in accordance with some intricate web of trails carried by the cells of the brain. So he's using the word web, but not the internet web, but the web of neurons. He continued with this proposition later in memex 2, not published till 67, again not built. And the kind of things he says here are beyond what he said in 1945. For example, he says this machine needs to learn from its own experience and thus improve its judgments. Memex needs to graduate, put its mind to work. The result, he speculated, might be a machine that would remold the trails of the user's brain as the cells of the brain become realigned and reconnected. So there's a shift from memex preserving creative associations of the brain to a role for this device in shaping the mind, training it to make associations and record them. Albeit, I have to say, with no real account of how this could happen, not from Bush. Strangely, though, at the same time, Bush belatedly admitted that some of the pathways in the brain were, in his word, haphazard. Something philosophers such as Thomas Hobbes and John Locke had identified in the 1600s, as did the Harvard psychologist William James in 1890. But why preserve such associations compared to real connections? I now move to the whole question of machines that think. In 1833, when Lady Ada Lovelace, Byron's daughter, spoke about Charles Babbage's first calculating engine, she said, "We went to see the thinking machine, in brackets, for such it seems." But in July 1945, Time magazine again showed less caution. It ran an article entitled "A Machine That Thinks," reporting that Bush, quote, predicts a brain robot that will relieve man of much of the routine spade work of thinking. Dr. Bush's thinking machine, which he calls memex, would be a desk with a microfilm reader inside. So it's referring to the memex as a thinking machine. But this depiction conflates memex with the arithmetical, accounting and calculating devices, some of which had already been awarded the thinking tag that Bush surveyed in the first parts of the article. Bush saw no reason why such machines, a word he used 39 times, should be confined to numbers. They might also manipulate propositions according to formal logic. Quote, "Put a set of premises into such a device and turn the crank, and it will readily pass out conclusion after conclusion, all in accordance with logical law and with no more slips than would be expected from a keyboard adding machine." Yet memex did nothing like this, as Bush of course was aware. It did not induce generalizations from data or apply rules to a sequence of propositions. It did not of itself generate new ideas. Rather, it snap-froze the mental associations of its owners, at least those constituted as such by links registered between these different microfilm documents. Bush called his article "As We May Think," but the memex was a search machine, and for searches within a pre-selected set of documents. It was not a calculating or thinking one. Now here's the point I think that's crucial. Nevertheless, this does not exclude it as an aid to the mind. Like Ramelli's book wheel, something else could be going on, because a machine that stores material and retrieves it on command could work as a support to memory and possibly thinking. This assistance can function in various ways already known by the use of external prompts such as notes, diagrams and lists. See footnote, the extended mind thesis in current cognitive psychology and philosophy. Bush's approach was predicated on the notion of mechanical thinking as servile and routine, contrasted with what he called creative thought, which was not. Again, the precedents for this are clear. Leibniz, again in the late 17th century, voiced this distinction when he hoped that, quote, astronomers surely will not have to continue to exercise the patience required for computation, for it's unworthy of excellent men to lose hours like slaves in the labour of calculation, which could be safely relegated to anyone else if machines were used. Hence, machines could assist higher intellectual work by doing the routine part. The Time magazine conjecture of a brain robot fitted this paradigm. Go to another slide here. Now, when Time magazine gets a real run, Bush seems to have an open line to them. But here, beyond Bush, in 1982, Time magazine announced this time the machine of the year, the computer. By that date, any link with Bush, who had been renowned as a prince of analogue computing, was probably tenuous. And from today's perspective, it's tempting to say the memex is closer to the book wheel than to the personal computers of the 1980s. But let's have a quick look. Did you say 5 minutes? Or, yes, I'm moving now to not long after Bush. Bush is still alive, but to two new people who imagined the personal computer and the internet before either were realities. Douglas Engelbart, with the mouse he invented, electronic mouse, and patented in 1970, invented in about 65. I'll come back to that. And then Joseph, nicknamed Licklick, managing to look like an FBI agent in a 1950s film. These two people knew each other, and they knew Bush, and they'd read How We May Think, and they agreed with Bush that the individual should become the focus, because at that time, the big mainframe computers just put in these batch programs, and you had to wait a week to get it back. They wanted the personal computer, but it wasn't there. So that's what they were doing. And Bush, just take that up. Oh, yeah. Engelbart, they're both interesting in what they say about the computer in the history of technology. They compare it to a sequence of other external aids to the mind, stone writing surfaces, wax tablets, notebooks, and so on. It's another one of those. Engelbart's phrase was, for the augmentation of the mind. Now, Bush had been doing that, but it is interesting that although Bush said these extraordinary, untested things about training the mind and whatever, he also said this in 1967. The general term thinking machines is an unfortunate expression, for they do not think, they merely aid man to do so. We compare this with Licklider's groundbreaking landmark article of 1960 called The Man-Computer Symbiosis. This is what he said. I'll just read that and you can read it too. The hope is that in not too many years, human brains and computing machines will be coupled together very tightly, and that the resulting partnership will think as no human brain has ever thought, and process data in a way not approached by the information handling machines we know today. Licklider distinguished between man plus machine, which was Bush, and referred to this symbiosis. In the story of the relationship between humans and thinking machines, this might be the moment when the page turned irrevocably towards our present situation. Thank you.